Bienvenidos a Gracias por tu Servicio, el podcast con la intención de hablar sobre los temas relevantes de los militares, veteranos y veteranas de Puerto Rico. En el episodio de hoy estaremos hablando con Talia Aikens-Nuñez sobre su libro Men of the 65th, The Borinqueneers of the Korean War. Bienvenidos a un nuevo episodio de Gracias por tu Servicio. En el episodio de hoy, que es nuestro número 65, quisimos rendirle homenaje a los hombres de la 65 de Infantería con una entrevista que le hicimos a la autora del libro Men of the 65th, The Borinqueneers of the Korean War, Talia Aikens-Nuñez, hace un par de semanas atrás. Pero antes de comenzar, quiero presentar a la compañera Nilmari Colón. Saludos, Colón.
Saludos por ti, hola. ¿Cómo se encuentran, verdad? Todos y todas. Qué bueno que estén con nosotros y esperemos, verdad, que este episodio les encante.
Colón, te quería preguntar, ¿cómo te fue la experiencia de entrevistar a la autora y ya sea algunos datos que ella trajo que te hayan sorprendido? Sé que en la entrevista le preguntaste sobre el research que ella hizo, entre otras cosas, que nos puedas compartir para adelantarle a los oyentes.
Primero que nada, me encantó de que, ¿verdad?, que ella tomara su tiempo y buscara información sobre nuestra historia y nuestra cultura, ¿verdad? Que es algo que siempre he pensado que lo necesitamos más, porque cada vez es menos información que tenemos de nuestro propio país. Y es triste ver que en las escuelas sí se enseñan ciertas cosas de nuestra cultura, de nuestro pasado, pero a veces nos enfocamos más en otras culturas extranjeras que no tienen nada de malo, no le estoy quitando. Pero, ¿verdad?, nos enfocamos en la cultura egipcia, en la cultura de China, el imperio chino, las mayas, los aztecas, que está perfecto. Pero le damos tanto énfasis en eso y estamos perdiendo tanta información valiosa de nosotros mismos como cultura, tanto militar, dentro o fuera de lo militar. O sea, no necesariamente para eso me refiero a la historia de Puerto Rico, que lo estamos perdiendo lamentablemente, porque cada vez estas cosas se pierden. Tú pones a pensar cuando tú visitas otro país, ellos tienen estos museos espectaculares y sí, mucha gente dice, no, es que los niños chinos, por darte un ejemplo, lo hicieron tanto. Sí hicieron, es que por alguna razón no las estamos capturando como se supone. Y este libro captura importante información sobre los militares y la historia de los militares y la importancia de mantener viva esa historia, porque esas son historias que nos hacen orgullosos, que podemos aprender de ellas y nos dicen, pues yo los conozco, sé quiénes son. Quise empezar por esta parte, pero de los datos que ella mencionó que me impresionaron porque realmente no lo sabía, no lo conocía, era que ellos fueron juzgados. Para mí eso fue un shock porque decía, ¿en serio? Es como una falta de respeto. ¿Quién se atrevió? Pero esas son cosas que es algo real, que después de ciertos años pues lograron pues mejorar y ahí recibieron sus premios y todo eso, pero eso para mí fue un choque de que unos héroes y unas personas que hicieron lo que hicieron, puertorriqueños, tuvieran que pasar por ese momento tan incómodo y me imagino frustrante, porque imagínate tú ir a luchar lejos a otro país, no tu lenguaje, no tu clima, nada. Y cuando regreses lo que te dieron fue problemas y problemas. Para mí eso fue shock. Tengo muchas ganas de terminar el libro para ver qué más puedo aprender.
Definitivamente, yo estoy en el proceso también de comenzar el libro. Quiero compartir que vamos a tener la descripción de dónde puede conseguir los libros en el link del episodio. Así que, por favor, si les interesa este tema, quieren apoyar este proyecto de Talia Aikens-Nuñez, por favor, traten de cooperar para que esta historia sea conocida por más personas. Por el otro lado, tenemos al brother Víctor Vivas. Saludos, bro.
Saludos a todos los veteranos y militares que nos están escuchando, en especial a todos esos veteranos que han servido a este 65. Estamos orgullosos.
Hablando de orgullo y hablando de la 65, una de las cosas que señalaste y que yo creo que lo hemos mencionado unas cuantas veces aquí en el podcast es que tú fuiste parte de la 65 en un tiempo de tu carrera militar. ¿Cuán orgulloso te sentiste al saber que ella había publicado este libro y había dado tanto a luz a lo que pasaron estos compañeros por allá?
Gracias, bro. Para comenzar, que una persona que no vive en Puerto Rico, que solamente tiene familiares cercanos que hayan servido al 65 o al 75 Infantería, le dé esta motivación a ella para escribir un libro, para escribir, y no tan solo escribir, sino en dedicarse, sentarse, vamos a leer de dónde es que sale el 65, quiénes son los que sirvieron en el 65, a dónde fueron, qué no hicieron, qué recibieron, cómo fueron afectados, qué más, qué problemas recibieron, el maltrato, el abuso físico, el abuso emocional, la frustración, el enojo. Si sigo hablando por ahí para abajo, pues les cuesta el libro. Pero como soldado de 65 Infantería que fui por 6 años, el poder escuchar todos estos años, la información y la historia de 65, cuando llegué día 0 de 65 Infantería, que nos regalan un libro, conoce tu batallón, conoce dónde tú estás sirviendo. Es el momento que tú desarrolles ese orgullo porque tú estás en el mejor batallón de Puerto Rico y de Estados Unidos. En Fort Benning nos rompen, nos desarrollan y nos amoldean como infanteros. Pero llegar a 65 Infantería, día 0, que te dicen, este es tu batallón, aquí tú vas a estar, este es tu platoon sergeant, con estos son los que tú vas a servir, ya tú estás con la mente, wow, llegué al mejor batallón de Puerto Rico, a donde hay una historia pesada y tú no puedes bajar, sentar cabeza, no hay break de fallar, y eso es una de las cosas que me enseñó el 65 Infantería, que claro está, ya uno con la madurez, si uno se permite fallar, y no te da break de fallar, y ese orgullo tan grande que te inculca el 65 Infantería, el haberlo escuchado en otra persona que se dedicó en cuerpo y alma, primero respeto y segundo un gran orgullo por ella dedicar su tiempo, su sudor y sacrificio para escribir el batallón que yo pertenezco.
Y el research de ella yo creo que fue más de 10 años. So, gracias a Talia nuevamente por escribir este libro de los compañeros. Como mencioné, en el episodio de hoy profundizamos en la notable historia de la 65 de Infantería y exploramos su profundo significado dentro del ejército de los Estados Unidos y por supuesto en Puerto Rico. Estos valientes soldados de Puerto Rico desempeñaron un rol extraordinario en la configuración no solo de la historia militar, sino también de la identidad cultural de su tierra natal. Para guiarnos a través de este cautivador viaje, tuvimos el privilegio de entrevistar a Talia Aikens-Nuñez, autora de Men of the 65th, The Borinqueneers of the Korean War. Su incansable investigación y su habilidad narrativa han creado una historia convincente que da vida al increíble legado de los Borinqueneers, convirtiéndose en una historia accesible y agradable para todos. Únase a nosotros mientras descubrimos las hazañas heroicas y el impacto duradero de la 65, un capítulo de la historia que a menudo se pasa por alto, pero que merece nuestra atención y nuestro respeto. Our guest for this episode is Talia Aikens-Nuñez, the author of the book Men of the 65th, The Borinqueneers of the Korean War. Talia became inspired to become an author after the birth of her daughter, as she realized the importance of having multicultural stories for her bilingual child. Her books include OMG, Am I a Witch? OMG, I Did It Again. OMG, Is He Also a Witch? Colors of the Sun and Moon. Escucha means listen. Small Nap, Little Dream. And her most recent book, Men of the 65th, which was released in May of 2023. Welcome to our podcast, and thanks for joining us, Talia.
Thank you so much for having me.
For us, it's a pleasure. As I said before we started recording, the story of the Borinqueneers means so much to us. We could talk about these amazing human beings that put their lives on the line for the United States in a foreign land. We could talk for ages about them, and we're always awed about what they went through. So thanks again for writing that. Before we go into it, I had a question about your books. Are all of them in English or some of them in Spanish?
Some of them have been translated to Spanish. I'm hoping that this one actually will be as well. I'm just waiting to hear from my publisher about when that time will come.
Okay, that's awesome. And what has been the feedback of having these stories from parents of the kids that read these books?
Oh, it's so much fun. It's really honestly an honor when you get some fan mail or something, someone emails you or something like that. that tells you about the impact that your book had on them, especially kids. And if you're inspiring kids to read, it just makes me feel really good.
Yeah, I love to read. My kids started reading because they saw me read so much. So they got into their habits of reading. They did the young adult series, and my daughter, she just loves all like the Twilights and the Harry Potters and all that kind of stuff. But it was because they saw me read so much that they actually like it as well. So that's great. I'm going to go into the questions real quick. My first question for you is, for those that don't know the story of the 65th Infantry, can you give us a brief summary of what the book is about?
Sure. So the 65th Infantry Regiment, globally, they were the only Latino segregated unit in the military, in the Army. They served in World War I, World War II, and then they really got their chance to shine in the Korean War. Mostly in World War I, World War II, they were mostly relegated to supporting roles because of segregation practices. But in the Korean War, also because the military was so depleted, they were sent to the front lines. They actually did this exercise that I highlight in the book called Operation Port Rex that took place on Vieques. And they were pitted against some of the most decorated people in the military. Basically, it was an exercise where people had to come and try to take the island from them. So they were considered the aggressors who took the island, and then the liberators were going to come and knock them off the island. Well, the people that served in World War I, World War II, that were part of all these decorated military units, couldn't even get on the island because they fortified it so heavily. They actually had to go out and create the pathways to let the people in. So they had to make the roads in to let them be attacked. And still, so those military exercises had a time limit. By the time it ended, they still weren't pushed off the island, which was supposed to be the goal of the liberators. But that's just a small story to illustrate that this was a really well-trained unit. And so when they went to the Korean War, which, by the way, they were sent on a boat, didn't know where they were going. They were just sent on a boat that they were going to go somewhere, packed on this boat to the point where people had to rotate sleeping. Everyone didn't have their own bunk. They had to rotate sleeping. They had to rotate eating for a very long time to get towards Korea. And then, of course, when they landed in Korea, they fought in all sorts of conditions. They fought in like these bitter -10, -15 with wind conditions, these very hot southern Korean temperatures. And they were heroic. There's one specific time, which at this point in the war, the Chinese and the North Koreans surrounded the Marines. And so the Borinqueneers actually were given this very hard task to go in to create a line to bring the Marines out. And they did that. And then they were actually some of the last people on that part of South Korea that had to actually evacuate further south, because at that point in the war, they had to retreat. So then the book, of course, goes through many of these battles that they were so successful in, and then some of the military practices that changed that then changed some of their success. And then just the complexion of the war itself changed. It was a very fluid war, and then it became very stagnant and kind of entrenched. And they were in charge of trying to get this hill that was beyond their main line of resistance. So it was in enemy territory. It was a hill that actually had no ability for support. So you couldn't have air support or anybody else support you, kind of on this like island on this hill. They lost that hill, and they had many casualties. And then they had some other small losses after that, which then got to this other point where they were on another hill that also had similar demographics. Like you couldn't actually dig in like a traditional military practice of digging in. And some men, as the military framed it at the time, refused to fight. And so they were a part of the largest court-martial in the Korean War. But after we find out in history and through, the release of documents and things like that, that they were unfairly targeted. There were other units who also refused to fight on that hill because it was so impenetrable, and they weren't court-martialed. So, of course, now they've all been exonerated and they've all received honorable discharges. But at the time, they didn't. They had wages taken, all sorts of other things that happened to them because of this. But the book basically highlights this slice of history of this very heroic unit.
One of the things that I read in the book, and I didn't understand the impact of the amount of court-martials, it was over 160 court-martials, which made it the largest at that time.
Yeah, and then what was it, 91, I think, that were found guilty, and some had some really excessive sentences of like 10 years of hard labor. And, you know, for men that already were fighting heroically in a war to then be sentenced to that, you know, but this is the reason why we read history, we study history, so that we don't repeat it, because this is something that should never be repeated.
That's good to know, because this kind of stuff that you don't spend the time and research and do this book, we'll probably lose this information. We're gonna never knew about it. So pretty nice that you could capture that, something really important, right? Mm-hmm. My question is, what motivates you to write this book?
So I was actually at a family event. My husband was born and raised in Puerto Rico. So we're at a family event, you know, my kids, my husband's family, his grandfather. And at that time, he was showing me some of his military decorations. And he told me that he was a Borinqueneer. And I was like, oh, who are they? Just ignorant. I just didn't know. And he told me their story. And of course, I get on Google. I try to find books about them for myself and for my kids, because I wanted my kids to know this very important part of history. And I couldn't find anything. I'd written other children's books before this. And so I remember on the car ride home, after I was telling my husband I couldn't find anything, he was like, well, I guess you have to write something. And so I did. And so then I started researching it and had a really, I don't say fun research journey, but a really good research journey learning about this unit.
You began the research in 2020, right?
No, I began the research in when did I get the Congressional Gold Medal? 2013? Yeah, I researched for many years. I interviewed Borinqueneers who were still living. I watched reels from the History Project through the Library of Congress and watched a ton of different interviews and tapes and memorabilia. It was a really interesting journey, just learning about them.
I have one question about that. For you, what was the best way to do the research, or which one was the best tool or more helpful for you to understand the unit?
Yeah, the Veterans History Project through the Library of Congress, that was really the best tool because I got to hear the stories from the soldiers. So it really personalized it and it really brought context to it. Because a lot of times you'll read something in a history book, but it's very general. It's about how many casualties there were, what their formations were, and things like that. But really hearing the individual soldiers' stories just completely changed the complexion of it for me and made it that much more interesting.
Vivas, you got something?
First of all, my name is Victor. I was a former 65th Infantry soldier from 2013 to 2019.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah. So I'm the new school of the 65th Infantry soldiers. So I feel very proud that you took this opportunity to write this book. So I would like to have it. And having this in mind, what are the most interesting things that you discovered throughout the process of writing it?
The most interesting thing I discovered was the different treatment that the men experienced versus other soldiers. You know, you hear about that generally, but I got to find out about very specific things. Everything from, you know, as a punishment, changing their food, which are called rations, which were rice and beans, but as a punishment, they took those away. Or a punishment of removing showers, like these inhumane things to do to people who are fighting for our country, and what they dealt with and they were able to succeed in, even though they dealt with, just overcoming the adversity was just, it was amazing.
For me, like being in the 65th, reading about the history, about the background, that all the suffering that they had, it shows a lesson. We're soldiers, but we're not going to suffer anymore. So they were like suffering a lot with the cold weather, the lack of resources. Mm-hmm. And I know that the army is changing, but still we're Puerto Rican soldiers and we have this bias still working for the U.S. Army, but having in mind the suffering that the 65th had. So that's why I like the book.
Thank you.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask was, what has been the overall feedback of the readers of this book?
Yeah, I've gotten great feedback, honestly. I've gotten a lot of people that have reached out to me to say, thank you for writing this. Teachers that have said they're going to try to incorporate it into their classroom, librarians. It makes me so happy, especially hearing that, because I really want kids to know this history. I felt so just ignorant when I didn't know about it, and my grandfather-in-law told me about these men. That's just like, to me, was horrible. I went through high school, I went through college, I have a master's degree, and I never learned about this history. So I just wanted to keep that from happening anymore.
Awesome. I had a follow-up question I forgot to ask. Is your husband's grandfather still around?
He is not. He has passed on.
Okay, well, we're sorry for the loss, because I know there's still a couple of them that are still around. They usually try to have them come to the ceremonies that we have here in Puerto Rico, either through Memorial Day, Veterans Day, or Puerto Rican Veterans Day as well. All the organizations such as DAV, American Legion, and others try to do as much activities with them as possible, because they still want to show them so much appreciation. Because like Vivas was saying, the Army has changed, but we still go through certain things, and maybe because where we're from, but we actually perform better because of it.
How have family members reacted to it?
So I dedicated the book to my husband's grandfather. He's the one that told me the story, and they were very happy. They're, very honored to have it dedicated to him. And my family loves that, I'm highlighting this bit of history that was kind of, I won't say like swept under the rug, but, there wasn't enough of a spotlight on it. And so they were very proud of me for doing that and putting so many years into it, because this took a long time.
Have other family members reached out and sent you any type of message?
I've had a lot of children and grandchildren of former 65th soldiers reach out to me, and they're really happy that this book was able to highlight their honorable service, because after the court martials, the Army tried to dissolve parts of the unit and remove them from the Army. So it left what a lot of people felt was a stain almost. But it was the Congressional Gold Medal and then writing this book that I want to make sure that that stain was erased.
That's great.
Hey, bro, as a remark, I think this is the second book of the 65th Infantry. The first one is the one that the National Guard provides for the soldiers in the 65th. So I believe this is the second one.
The person that wrote that one, his name is Colonel Gilberto Villahermosa, and he wrote my preface of my book. And he's a great historian. He's amazing.
It's very nice that you know the Colonel. And I don't know, for me, if I was a writer of the second book of the 65th, I would be proud of that.
Yeah. No, I really am.
Going to the question, what do you think is the most important for people to learn about the men of the 65th Infantry?
Their dedication and their sacrifice. Understanding that they, I don't think people understand that they were sent to a region that was 0 degrees and they had on summer clothes and they still fought. They created heaters. They created ways to stay warm, even though they weren't provided. And they still fought day and night in the middle of the night, because North Koreans and the Chinese love to attack at 2 a.m., coldest part. And they didn't even have the nice type of sleeping bags. They had to get out of the sleeping bags and fight in the middle of the night in 0 degrees in shorts, essentially. And that type of dedication is amazing. And I just want people to understand all of that they sacrificed and all that they did, even when, they had all these other things happening to them in their unit. They had a leader at one point that told them that they had to shave their facial hair because they weren't manly enough. And all of these atrocities that happened to them, and they still fought and they were still honorable men.
I just want to point out also that, people, they may not know, but we live in the Caribbean, which is tropical. So we are not used at all for cold weather. like it's kind of difficult to everybody, but imagine someone that always live and grew up in a tropical weather. When you go to the cold, it's so different because you have to learn how to deal with it. You have to know what injuries can occur or what are the options that you have in that weather. So I will say that's kind of interesting that how difficult for them or how challenging it will be because they were not used to them. And remember, this happened like a long time ago. There were not the same information that we have right now, that we may have an idea how the cold weather will look like. But for most of them, I believe it may be the first time that they see weather like that.
And don't forget that they were actually put on a boat and didn't even know where they were going. They were still going to go fight, and they were going to do it wherever it was. So that type of dedication, it's just amazing. And then to do it in these frigid temperatures with ice and snow falling and fighting on top of it, it's unimaginable to me.
Having in mind also that the language barrier, I don't know if they had maybe an American captain or sergeants, the lack of English and the knowledge. So the language barrier will be like, it sucks for them. I bet that sucks for them.
Well, it was interesting. One of their commanders actually used that to their benefit because the other soldiers couldn't understand what they were saying. And so they used it for maneuvering and encircling the enemy and things like that. So, what would be perceived as a weakness, they turned into a strength.
Mm-hmm. With the wind talkers as well. They actually had that advantage because of the language difference. So they were able to be successful in their missions as well.
Yep, exactly.
So how does it compare to other books you have written? I know this is more historical and it's about a particular topic, but what techniques as an author did you incorporate or did you see different?
So all of my other books are fiction. This is my first nonfiction book. I had to look at it completely differently. And then the way even you pitch a nonfiction book to publishers and to agents, it's done completely differently than it's done with fiction. And so there was a learning curve. So I had to figure out how to do that. And it's interesting. When you put that many years into something, it just made me that much more proud when it did come out. And it is getting like great support. So I am most proud of it.
You're going to have 3 more books sold right here. We can't wait to get our hands on it and read it. If it comes out in Spanish, eventually, then even better for us because we really want to share this story and, as you said, highlight it.
Will you like to write more books about Latino, Puerto Rican heritage?
I would. I completely would. Actually, the book prompted me to do a family vacation to Vieques because I really wanted to see, like when they did the Operation Port Rex that I was talking about before, like what that looked like. How did they fortify, how did they create their, what do you call it? Oh my gosh, I can't remember what they're called. Their command centers. And how did they did this actually interesting thing. They would take a palm tree and they go up about 6 to 7 feet and then cut it, but not all the way. So it went to like a triangle. And then they wrapped it in barbed wire. So it made it impossible for anybody to get through. But they used the land, the natural resources to their advantage. And so I just wanted to see it. And so ever since I went to Vieques, which I love and fell in love with, I've thought about maybe writing something else. I haven't exactly figured out what yet, but I definitely would.
Are there any future projects you would like to share?
I have a picture book coming out, but I don't have an exact date for it yet. So I have like different picture books that I write with different publishers, but I'm looking for another nonfiction project. And so I've got to figure that out.
Awesome.
Can I do a recommendation?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'm just excited because, like I said before, I'm so happy that someone took the time and the effort to do research about our history. And I also think not only the military, but also I think for Tainos, our Indian population, it's kind of hard for us, even for us that are Puerto Ricans, kind of hard for us to get information because most of the information is, like you said before, is more general, like places and stuff. But actually, there's not a lot of information or background that we can, or history, like other cultures. When you compare, for example, Mexico or Latin American, and there are a lot of histories, and in our case, kind of hard to find out more about the Taínos.
Yeah. Well, I'll look into that.
All right. Our last question is, where can people purchase the book?
So you can get it on Learner's website. So it's Learner Publishing Group. That's the publisher of the book. You could also get it on Amazon. I know that some people in Puerto Rico are having trouble with Amazon for shipping, but you can have Learner, if you go to the Learner website, then you can have it shipped from there.
And for our listeners, we're going to have the links to the books in the episode description. So if you want to purchase the book, they'll be there. Talia, thanks again. For us, it's a pleasure. And feel free to reach out to us when that book is coming out in Spanish. We would love to plug it as well, because we want as many people to listen to it. So please keep in touch.
Will do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks to you. For me, it would be great if the book can come here in Puerto Rico, because it's our history and it's something that it needs to be in our school. It could be English, it could be Spanish, either way. That would be great.
Talia, for dedicating such an amazing book to the 65th Infantry, and for me, like, belonging to such a honorable battalion. So it makes me proud. So thank you for your time, like dedicating all those words and pages for the 65th.
Thank you so much. You guys have been awesome.
Bueno, espero que todos hayan podido aprender algo sobre los Borinqueneers. Yo sé que para mí había un sinnúmero de datos que yo no conocía y honestamente mientras más leo, más me sorprendo. Recuerda que esta temporada estaremos auspiciados por nuestros amigos de Buff Bear. Mejora tus entrenamientos, muestra tu estilo y canaliza tu bestia interior con Buff Bear. Visite buffbearpr.com y disfrute de envío gratis en pedidos de $100 o más. Eleva tu entrenamiento con Buff Bear, la marca de ropa que está impactando el mundo de fitness. Quiero señalar que la semana que viene estaremos publicando nuestra entrevista con el equipo de Team Rubicon, así que no se lo pierdan. Para apoyar nuestro proyecto, síguenos en Facebook, Instagram y YouTube. Y por último, solo falta decir:
Gracias por tu servicio.